Hi, Misha here, and let's do another aircraft video, 172 scale diecast. And this time, let's go back to World War II and back to Germany. And let's talk about the Junkers, the Ju-88. And we have three versions here, all from Corgi. We've got an earlier Ju-88A, a later Ju-88A, and then a Ju-88C. The A was a bomber, dive bomber, whereas the C was more of an attack aircraft and fighter bomber. And this one over here is from the Battle of Britain. The one in the middle is from Operation Barbarossa, a little ways in towards the winter. And then this one here is actually from operations in Ukraine as a tank buster later on in the war. So it's the latest war variant. And not a lot of difference in these. We'll see some different engines. The armament and armor will be increased. And of course the overall role and usage. Because this was a very heavily used aircraft, not only as a bomber, fighter, it was also used as a torpedo aircraft, torpedo bomber, and a reconnaissance aircraft. It was the most produced double-engine plane in Germany from World War II, and honestly one of the most produced double-engine aircraft of anyone in World War II. Arguably the most successful of the German bombers, and they built over 15,000, some sources say over 16,000 total. Either way, quite a large number for Germany, given the size and everything else. But, as with many German aircraft, while it was perfectly good in 1940, 1941, as the war went on, it found itself increasingly outnumbered in the skies, and Germany found it had increasingly fewer and fewer available. So, kind of that story. So let's go ahead and dig in and talk about the beginnings back in 1935. Well, let's begin by putting my earlier Ju-88 A4/A5 on the stand. The two are very similar. In fact, the A5 came out before the A4. We'll get into all that. This one's in 1940, right as they started to be produced in numbers, but development went back all the way to 1935. And this was actually considered a long development period at this time and era. Yeah, remember when that happened? Ask the F-35 or the Eurofighter or any of that. But anyway, this one doesn't really represent an early A0 or A1, but we'll talk about them. And this really started off as one of the Schnell bombers, the fast bombers. In 1935, the Air Ministry wanted, well, a fast, high-speed, relatively high-altitude, 3-seat, unarmed bomber that could carry about a 1,000-kilogram payload with good range. And in 1936, early in the summer, around June, Junkers presented two designs, the Ju-85 and the Ju-88. And the Luftwaffe, well, the Air Ministry, Luftwaffe, Hermann Goering, ordered the 88. Two initial prototypes with 3 additional pre-production or test models soon to follow. So total order of 5. And the first one was ready to fly in December and took to the sky on December 21st, 1936, and did very well. It got up to 360 miles per hour, which was very fast for a twin-engine bomber of that day and time. but it had the crew of 3 and essentially no guns, yada yada. It was just meant to be a fast bomber. But after the Spanish Civil War and other things in 1937, times were a-changin'. Late that year, around October, it was ordered to turn this into at least an optional dive bomber. The Ju-87 was really showing itself to be effective and useful. And so they wanted the Ju-88 to not only be able to do tactical bombing, but also dive bombing. So they had to add dive brakes, expand the wings out, and they increased the crew from 3 to 4 because they wanted to have guns. They had to have guns if it was a dive bomber. So initially, we had 3 MG-15s, one located on the underside of what we call the gondola here, one located in the nose, and one located in the rear, kind of facing upwards. Now, the pilot was the pilot. That's what he did, which is good because this was actually quite a difficult aircraft for people to fly at that time. The bombardier would double as the nose gunner, and our navigator and radio operator would man the 2 rear-facing guns. So everyone had a duty, plus, hey, if we're under attack, man a gun. The initial version here, there were 10 pre-production, known as the Ju-88A0 series. They had wingspans of just under 60 feet, overall length of just over 47 feet. They had the guns we talked about. They had some added armor and reinforcement, the dive brakes. They could carry up to 5,100 pounds in 2 internal bays, 3,100 pounds. I mean, but really this stressed it to the limit. They were better off not. Typically 1,500 to 2,000 pounds total. If they wanted to go to the full over 5,000, they usually had to mount things under the wings. The internal bays were really usually only good for about 2,000 kilograms and 1,100 kilograms respectively, so a little bit smaller. 2 standard engines. Really the big difference when they went to the Ju-88A1 version, they went from a 4-bladed propeller to a 3. And the 88s were first introduced to kind of an experimental flying squadron of the Luftwaffe in August of 1939, just in time for a handful to be used in the invasion of Poland. And then the A1 was put into full production, but very small numbers that year. Fewer than 70 were built before the 1939 was over. The first combat against the British would be on September 26, when these would be used to attack British shipping off the coast. A role they were actually quite good at. So, the only real downside, now we can dive bomb, now we have some guns, but all this added stuff slowed the top speed with bombs down to 290, sometimes even 280 miles per hour. So, more engines were needed, stronger, everything else. Also, the dive bombing was very stressful on the airframe, even with the already expanded wings and reinforced system. So, yeah. And they would continue to have various prototypes and test modules, units for other things. But by 1940, it was in full production. For what it's worth, the A2 used different engines and also could support rocket-assisted takeoff. And the A3 was a dual-control trainer. It was unarmed. So the next real combat versions were the Ju-88A4 and Ju-88A5. Again, very similar, and these would all be the bomber versions. So, yeah, let's kind of talk about how things went once war were declared. Let's take our earlier version off the stand. These were supposed to be in full service by 1938, but on September 1st, 1939, only about a dozen were in the Luftwaffe, and those were in the hands of experimental squadron anyway. They were supposed to be able to build 300 per month. Eventually they would get close to this goal, but it wouldn't be until around 1941. But in 1940 they would start to see some use. They were used off of Norway in April and May for anti-shipping, a role they were pretty darn good at. In fact, on April 9, a flight of Ju-88s would do some pretty major damage to HMS Rodney. They would lose 3 or 4 Junkers, but this would have a psychological impact on the British. In June, they would also sink a major passenger liner turned troop transport. And they were also used over Europe. They were used in France in the opening days of the invasion. They attacked over 200 French aircraft on the ground, destroying somewhere between 230 and 250. And then, after that, they started using their dive bombing ability to go at the French transport system, mostly the railways, but also some of their trucks, destroying quite a bit of logistics, and wreaking havoc. These were the early A1s. They were proving that the dive bombing was a heck of a lot of stress on the airframe, and that they were a little too slow, they were a little too vulnerable, they were under-armored, under-gunned. So already in the spring of 1940, work was underway to make a new version. This would result in the 88A4. But it would take a little time, especially for the engines they wanted to become available. So beginning around August of that year, the 88A5 here was introduced. Essentially, it was an 88A1 updated with the longer wingspan, nearly 66 feet, with rounded tips from the A4 project, but it still retained the older engines. So it wasn't a lot faster, but it was better in a dive bomb and more stable. It was also easier to handle, which is good because they were losing a way too high number of these to accidents, frankly. They would also start up-gunning and up-armoring it because, well, yeah, it was being used more and more. And like I said, this one here is a Battle of Britain. One of the earliest uses is a night aircraft, an intruder, what have you. This one has kind of a unique paint scheme, but it still has only 3 guns, one on the bottom, one on the back, one on the front, and a crew of 4. They always did. So the A5 was a stopgap measure model, produced in 1940, 1941, and by 42 is pretty much, taken over by the A4. And most of the older A1s were updated with the new wing. One interesting fact, the A5 actually had a space outboard of the engines for one more bomb rack on each wing than the later ones. Find it kind of interesting. But yeah, these were used over Britain, over France, over Norway, and of course the 88A, be it 1, 5, or 4, was coming into its own in June of 1941 when Nazi Germany invaded Russia too. Using last night's snow, let's see how well this camo matches up. I don't know, that'd be fun. Alright, it's cold out here. I'm gonna go in. Well, hope you enjoyed that little snowy field trip. Here it is. This, like I said, is the most recent one from Corgi. Kind of their Operation Barbarossa series they just put out in 2021, 2022. This is a later one, 1941, 42 era. And when they went to the A4, they went to uprated, more powerful engines. This allowed the top speed to get close to 300 miles per hour again. It also let it have a higher ceiling from about 23,000 feet up to about 26. And theoretically, the bomb load was over 7,000 pounds, but of course, there were lots of penalties for this. So, yeah. They also added more armor, especially to the cockpit area, and they added more weapons to defend the plane. We've got 2 machine guns in the rear now, and we have 2 forward facing, one kind of in the upper glass, one in the lower nose. And while we still only have one on the gondola underside, sometimes it would end up being a double barrel, the MG81Z. That's another thing. Sometimes the drum fed 15s would be replaced by the the MG81 or the MG131, more improved belt fed types. So still 8mm, 7.92, but more feed and with more armor, slightly better speed. These were more durable for bombing, and they could take more of a hit if it were. They would also do things like updating the radio and other equipment. And by this point, they're being used more in the ground attack role, either conventional bombing or dive bombing, and less in the heavy fighter or strategic type bombing roles. More going for tanks and trucks and planes on the ground than bunkers and structures and what have you. But the 88A4 was ready just in time for Barbarossa. By this point, the A1s are pretty much all gone, either turned into A5s or lost, and production was humming along quite well, and Goering was happy. At this point, things are still going pretty good for the Germans, but of course 1942 and 43 would be when it all changed. I should point out that some earlier planes would get the additional machine guns, even sometimes additional armor, so it wasn't an instant change. There was a transitional period when they tried out new ways of building these guys. The 88s did especially well in the northwest of Russia, kind of repeating what they had done in France, destroying several planes on the ground, tanks, cars. They also bombed, strafed infantry formations. But as the Russians got their act together, they started fighting back, and of course they started receiving better equipment, both from their own factories and from Lend-Lease. So the Germans started to lose more and more Ju-88s, despite the advancements of the A4s. They still tried using them as a bomber, but they became more and more utilized as a fighter, and eventually we'll talk about the whole C series and whatnot. But bombing would continue throughout 42, despite heavier and heavier losses. Now, in 1943, the tide had already kind of turned in the west, especially after the invasion of Italy. And the Allies thought they had air supremacy, so much so that they didn't really protect one of the captured Italian ports, Bari. And they had a major operation there of ships coming in with goods and material for the war. And on December 2nd, the Luftwaffe mounted a raid using mostly Ju-88s. And it was a surprise. There was not much air cover protection. And so they sank over 20 ships, damaging more and the facilities, and this took the Allies unaware. But this was kind of the last major bombing victory of the Ju-88. Keep in mind that 2/3 of all of these built were bombers, dive, tactical. So, yeah. Now, they tried to keep using them throughout 1944. They even tried deploying them around D-Day, but losses were heavy. By this time, the Allies really were reigning supreme in the air, and this was becoming an older and older aircraft, slower and slower compared to newer Spitfires and the P-51 and even the P-47 and what have you. So its days were numbered. In fact, it wasn't long after D-Day that the Luftwaffe suspended bombing flights for the Ju-88. Its initial role, it was no longer being used for However, the story definitely doesn't end there. In fact, in other ways, it would serve right up till the end of the war. And even actually post-war, some countries like France and also for a few years Finland, who had purchased about 2 dozen off Germany, would fly these in the late 40s and into the very early 1950s. So, interesting aircraft. And this model is neat because it does have the improved armament. Still from Corgi, same features, gear up or down, nice all metal construction. You'll have to let me know how its camo held up in the snow. And with that, let's move on to our third and final example. And our final JU-88 is the JU-88C. Specifically, this is an 88C6. And if that's not specific enough, there are actually variants of it. A, B, C, and so on. We'll get into that. This is a fighter version. Even though Goering did not want fighters, he wanted bombers. Really, in 1939, they did it without him. They took the 7th JU-88 prototype and modified it. They replaced the glazed bomber nose with a solid plated metal nose, incorporating two 20mm cannon and two 8mm machine guns, and they removed the under fuselage gondola and reduced the crew to 3. From there, they would take some of the early JU-88A1s and modify them into the JU-88C0, which was the pre-production series of the fighter/ground attack aircraft, and these would be trialed out in Poland late in 1939 against targets, essentially replacing the bomber nose with the solid nose and adding guns. Results were good enough that in 1940 they pushed forward. The next step was the JU-88C2. Now the C1 and C3 were planned but never produced because the engines were not available. So the C2 was the next one, and these were again modified 88A1s. Now they're trying out a mix of 3 8mm machine guns and 1 20mm cannon. Still a crew of 3. Although soon they would keep the gondola. First, not really doing much with it, just it was easier to keep it than replace it. But then they would start using it. The JU-88C4 was the first purpose-built from the ground up heavy fighter variant. These are still day fighters at this point. Important later. Well, sort of day fighters. We'll get to it. It was very much based on the 88A4 with the larger wing, rounded tips, the added armor, and now we have the solid nose incorporated. Although I think some of them may have kept the glazed nose and went to 2 20mm cannon in the gondola. They played around with the armament. The thing is, they didn't make many of the C4s. They really didn't. It was a transitional. It retained the bottom machine gun down here too. And other changes would kind of go from there. Now these early versions, C0, C2, C4, they would be used in a lot of maritime roles to attack shipping, strafing ships, also to protect German ships like U-boat areas. And beginning in late 1940, they would be used to defend Germany at night against incoming British bombers. And for a little bit of time, they were even used as intruder planes flying over to the UK to try to knock out the English bombers before they left their airfields. But these operations were not successful. They just didn't have enough aircraft, and the Brits were determined, so pretty unsuccessful. Instead, they would actually transfer a lot of these earlier 88Cs down to Italy, where they would fly maritime patrols and defensive intruder type missions over the Mediterranean, fighting around Malta, that kind of thing. And in 1942, we get this version here, the Ju-88C6. This was really the major version that was produced. Now, they never built near as many of the fighter versions as they did the bombers. But still, this was the one to be produced the most. The C6 was an update of the C4 with yet more armor added. By this point, the dive brakes are gone. We've kind of standardized on an armament payload. We've got the solid nose with 3 8mm machine guns, one 20mm cannon, and we have 2 additional 8mm machine guns mounted in the gondola. By this point, of course, we have a crew of 4 again. So we've got 5 machine guns in the front, plus a cannon. And then we have 2 machine guns in the rear, 8mm, for defense. And we have the other updates that we'll see for the, A4s and later versions, including the more powerful engines. The C series, at least most of them, could carry a small bomb load. Not a whole lot, 1,000, maybe 1,200 pounds, but a little bit of a payload. Typically, even for the A models, the internal bays, like I said, there are 2 of them, a larger one and a smaller one. A lot of times they were used for a fuel tank or 2 fuel tanks. Relatively forward-thinking, all things considered. Anyway, these would continue to be used around aquatic areas. For example, they were used in the Bay of Biscay to help U-boat operations in 1942, 1943. And they really started to see more and more use on the Eastern Front in Russia. And like this model here, flying out of occupied Ukraine, they would attack Russian tank formations, Russian supply depots, and they were kind of famous or infamous for being train busters. They would go after supply trains, the railroad system, and with so many machine guns plus a cannon in the front, plus the added armor, so they could actually take a hit or 2. Yeah, and the nice thing is, too, the performance really wasn't compromised all that much. It wasn't much slower or anything less maneuverable than the A. When they were first studying these, they found that it really wasn't a faster aircraft than the Bf-110, the Messerschmitt. But what the Ju-88C really could offer, a lot more range, a lot more endurance. So either it could go a lot further, or it could fly longer patrol missions. And one would imagine with a crew of 3 and then later 4, it was a little more comfortable to share your duties and, hand things off and have someone else looking around. And yeah, so it was a pretty successful aircraft, despite some of the powers that be trying to make it not happen. And actually, these C models would continue to fly and be used even after bombing raids were canceled in 1944. They would continue to see service till the end of the war. They also even saw production into 1945, so they were among the last models built. But of course, this was primarily intended as a heavy day fighter and ground attack aircraft. But as we saw early on with the Battle of Britain and various other operations, there was a potentiality for a night fighter. And that gets us into variants of the C6 and one of the final versions, the 88G. And let's also snow test the 88C. See how all this camo matches up. And it's still cold out here, so now I'm gonna go in. Alright, let's take this one off the stand while we talk about night fighters. You'll notice on the wings there are no dive brakes. Also the different pattern of engine. And again, the bays would have been used more or less for fuel tanks probably. And these were of course painted in a winter scheme because, well, wintertime. In relatively early 1942, the 88C was first fitted with an early radar set. Of course, radar had been available earlier than that, but it was big enough and bulky enough that it wouldn't fit on small aircraft. It was getting small enough at this point it would fit on a relatively small bomber like this. Later on, of course, it would fit on even fighters like the Messerschmitt 262. But the first set would appear, and this would lead to kind of a change in the naming convention or an addition. 88 C6s without the radar would be the A, and with the radar would be Bs. And these would have some initial success against the British. They were a little slower because of the drag and weight, 20 miles slower, but their performance was, generally speaking, quite impressive. And then in late 1942, they would go to an improved radar, a little smaller, simpler, more reliable. But then in 43, the British would counter with a new jamming system. And then from there, the Germans would counter with a new version of radar, this becoming the 88 C6C. And by the spring of 1944, this was the most common and used and successful night fighter in the German Luftwaffe, and it would remain so throughout the year. And then this would lead to kind of one of the final variants, the 88G. Now, of course, the C, while it came from the factory as a dedicated fighter, it was being retrofitted into a night role. The G model was built from the beginning for the radar and thus as a night fighter. And so it was kind of the ultimate version for that potential use. Quite interesting in the whole game between the UK and Germany, trying to keep up with each other, and that arms race for radar and jamming and bombing and all that. But yeah, it is a little interesting. This started off in the very beginning as a bomber, and at the end it was used as a heavy fighter to counter bombers. I don't know, kind of funny how history works. End to end, here they are lined up. This is from 1940 or early 41. This is a pretty early model. Like I said, it's still an A5. It would be nice to have the 1A1 Corgi has done, but oh well. This one just came out and has a few more updates. It's from a little bit later in the war. And this one's an older one that I've had for a while. I've been meaning to show you. It's from 1943, give or take, Ukraine, so it's mid-war. Corgi has mostly done the A4 and A5. I know of at least one A6 they have done. I think they did an A10 version. And I don't know if they've ever done a G. I think they have done a C4, but they haven't done many of the Cs either. So I am happy to at least have one of those. These aircraft are quite neat. Of course, gear up or down, moving propeller. They're essentially all metal, including the tail and the bottom. These are older Corgis, especially, are pretty good at that. They do have flexible guns where needed. Antenna. Yeah, they're quite nice. And well, I wouldn't say they're cheap, but they're cheaper than They're still about half the price of their Hinkle 111s. Those have really gone up in price for whatever reason. But since this one just came in, this is number 13 in the series. I think this was number 7, if memory serves. And this was the previous one, number 12. But trying to do some more aircraft videos again, now that a few things have come in, and mostly we've done newer planes. So I thought, why not do a World War II? Plus, the recent snow gave a good opportunity to try out the camouflage, at least for most of them. So let me know what you think about the Ju-88 or, German bomber doctrine and World War II in general. It's quite interesting. With that, I do appreciate you tuning in. If you could, please like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.